History usually ends in war, but the final dynasty of Vietnam's Hung Kings did not. So what really happened to the first civilization of Vietnam?
The 12th Hung King Dynasty emerges as the final chapter of the Van Lang state, not through the flames of war, but through the quiet conclusion of a civilization that had fulfilled its historical role. By this period, Van Lang was no longer a primitive society. After centuries of development, the ancient Vietnamese had mastered wet rice agriculture, organized communal life, managed irrigation systems, and adapted to the highly dynamic environment of the Red River Delta. The fundamental challenges of survival had long been resolved. Society entered a prolonged phase of stability, but it was precisely this stability that raised a new question. How could order be maintained within a population that was growing, regionally diverse, and increasingly complex? Political authority under the 12th Hung King continued to operate through a tribal confederation model. Local leaders, known as lac lords and lac generals, held real power over production, ritual practices, and daily life within their territories. The Hung King did not rule through administrative decrees or standing armies. Instead, he functioned as a supreme symbolic figure, embodying tradition, ancestral legitimacy, and cosmic order. Power, therefore, was primarily ritualistic and moral, rather than coercive. The political mindset of this era was centered on balance. Humans did not seek to dominate nature, but to coexist with it. Social order was not enforced through written law, but through customary practices, oral traditions, and collective memory passed down across generations. Leadership was defined not by conquest, but by the ability to preserve harmony and continuity. However, as society grew more complex, the limitations of this political structure became increasingly evident. Dispersed authority made large-scale coordination difficult. At the same time, more centralized and militarized political entities were emerging in the surrounding region. Gradually, Van Lang entered a historical moment in which its existing institutions could no longer meet the demands of a changing world. The end of the 12th Hung King Dynasty, therefore, did not occur through sudden collapse or violent upheaval. There are no records of decisive battles or total destruction. Instead, history records a process of transition in which the historical role of Van Lang gave way to a new political formation, Ao Lac, characterized by greater centralization and organizational capacity. What makes this transition remarkable is the absence of cultural rupture. Throughout the shift in political authority, the cultural foundations of the ancient Vietnamese endured. Ritual practices, ancestor worship, village structures, and communal identity remained intact. The state changed, but the civilization continued. The 12th Hung King Dynasty, thus, holds profound historical significance. It demonstrates that Vietnamese history, from its earliest stages, was not shaped by collapse, but by adaptation. A resilient civilization is not one that resists change at all costs, but one that understands when to bring an era to a close so that history itself may continue to move forward.
After the 12th Hung King Dynasty entered its final phase, Van Lang existed in a highly unusual historical state, free from crisis, yet no longer driven by strong momentum for expansion or transformation. Many ancient civilizations experienced similar periods of equilibrium, but few left such a clearly traceable imprint as Van Lang. At this time, the ancient Vietnamese did not live in instability or scarcity. On the contrary, they lived within a social order so familiar that it had become almost invisible, accepted as the natural way of the world. It is precisely this familiarity that makes the era difficult to identify through major historical events. There were no wars of territorial expansion, no radical reforms, and no dramatic upheavals forcing immediate change. But history does not move only through catastrophes. It also advances through the accumulation of unseen limitations, and the 12th Hung King Dynasty stands as a clear example of this quieter historical process. In everyday life, The people of Van Lang continued to cultivate wet rice agriculture according to long-established seasonal cycles. The construction of embankments, irrigation channels, and flood control systems remained organized at the community level. Agricultural festivals, ancestral rites, and seasonal ceremonies served not only spiritual purposes, but also reinforced social cohesion. In a world without writing, ritual functioned as collective memory, a way to transmit history, values, and social order from one generation to the next. The Loch Lords and Loch Generals were not officials in the later bureaucratic sense. They were long-recognized community leaders whose authority rested on reputation and trust. Their power came not from formal decrees, but from their ability to resolve disputes, organize production, lead rituals, and maintain stability within the village. In such a society, authority was not separate from daily life. It was embedded within it. Within this context, the Hung King himself did not need to be a constant presence. His role was largely symbolic rather than administrative. He served as a spiritual anchor, linking the living community to its ancestors and to the sacred order of the past. This explains how the Hung King tradition could endure for many generations without a complex governing apparatus. Political legitimacy did not depend on coercive power, but on communal recognition. Yet the very structure that sustained Van Lang also limited its ability to adapt as the surrounding world began to change. To the north and northwest, new political entities were emerging, societies with higher levels of organization, more centralized authority, and clearly defined military systems. These societies operated through command structures, formal rules, and the ability to mobilize large forces. In comparison, Van Lang resembled a healthy but slow-moving body. It was stable but lacked rapid responsiveness. It was resilient but resistant to structural change. And history inevitably presents challenges where even stability, if unadapted, becomes an obstacle. One of the clearest signs of transition appeared in the way people began to think about security and territory. In earlier times, village communities functioned as natural fortresses. Dense forests, rivers, and intimate knowledge of the landscape provided sufficient protection. But as potential threats became more organized, the need for centralized defense and long-term strategic planning began to enter social consciousness. This shift did not occur overnight. It unfolded gradually, through stories, legends, and eventually through the emergence of larger, more fortified settlements. These developments signaled a transformation in political thinking, from dispersed communal autonomy towards the necessity of higher-level organization. Within this process, the historical role of the 12th Hung King Dynasty becomes increasingly clear. It was a period in which society recognized the aging of an old political model, even as it continued to live within it. The ancient Vietnamese did not destroy Van Lang, nor did they openly resist it. They remained within its structure until a new model emerged, one capable of reorganizing what already existed. The rise of An Duyong Vung and the formation of the Olok state should therefore not be understood as a violent replacement. Instead, it was the outcome of a long process of accumulation, during which the limitations of Van Lang became visible and the need for a new political structure grew unavoidable. Crucially, throughout this transition, there was no civilizational rupture. The people did not abandon their customs, forget their ancestors, or lose their cultural identity. They simply lived under a new political order, one better suited to new historical conditions. Van Lang did not disappear, it dissolved into Olok, forming a deep foundational layer of Vietnamese history. From the perspective of several millennia later, what stands out most about the 12th Hung King Dynasty is not what happened during it, but how it ended, not in tragedy, but in quiet transformation, not in destruction, but in transition. This reveals an early and enduring characteristic of Vietnamese history, the ability to move forward without denying the past. This dynasty reminds us that history is shaped not only by heroes and battles, but also by communities that preserve order,
recognize limitations, and willingly pass on their historical role when their time has come. In the silence of the 12th Hung King era, we can hear the long breath of a civilization, closing one chapter so that a new one in Vietnamese history could begin.
When the 12th Hung King Dynasty reached the end of its historical role, there was no precise moment when people of the time realized they were entering a new era. History, at that point, did not unfold through formal declarations or clearly recorded events. It moved instead through slow shifts in order, through changes in how people organized their lives, understood power, and imagined the security of their communities. Within this transitional historical space, the name Ung Duong Vuong began to emerge as a signal of a new age. Yet to understand his role accurately, we must move beyond the simplified view that he replaced the Hung Kings through force alone. Ung Duong Vuong did not appear in a vacuum. He emerged upon the foundations of Van Long, shaped by everything the 12th Hung King Dynasty had accumulated and left behind. By this time, the ancient Vietnamese had grown accustomed to a stable way of life, but they also began to sense new forms of uncertainty. Communities that once felt secure within the boundaries of village life now faced the need for broader connections. The space of survival was no longer limited to familiar fields and rivers. It expanded into territory that required protection. This marked the moment when political thinking shifted to a higher level, from local community to early statehood. In both historical tradition and legend, Ung Duong Vuong is inseparably linked to the formation of Ao Lak. While many details remain wrapped in myth, the historical core is clear. Ao Lak represented a political system that was more centralized, more conscious of territory, and deeply focused on defense. Unlike Van Long, where authority was dispersed and closely tied to ritual, Ao Lak required unified command. This transformation did not arise solely from personal ambition, but from historical necessity. As threats became more organized and the space of survival expanded, society needed a structure capable of large-scale coordination and mobilization. It was in this context that Ko Loa Citadel emerged as a new symbol of power. Ko Loa was not merely a defensive structure, it marked a fundamental shift in political thinking. For the first time, political authority was clearly anchored in physical space, defined by walls, moats, and controlled access to the surrounding region. The construction of Ko Loa cannot be understood as a purely military effort. It reflected a major leap in social organization. Such a project required massive labor mobilization, centralized leadership, and a level of social discipline far beyond what had existed before. Ao Lak society had accepted a critical trade-off, a reduction in communal autonomy in exchange for security and long-term survival. Yet even as political structures changed, the cultural soul of Van Long did not disappear. Ritual practices, ancestor worship, and village-based social bonds continued beneath the surface of the new state. Ung Duong Vuong did not dismantle the old order, he reorganized it within a new framework. This continuity explains why Ao Lak should not be viewed as a rupture, but as a transformation. The people did not become strangers to themselves, they simply lived under a new political structure, one that demanded greater discipline and stronger defensive capacity. At the same time, this transition introduced internal tensions. As authority became more centralized, distance grew between the political center and local communities. Decisions once guided by custom and consensus increasingly followed command and strategy. This tension is the cost every society pays when moving from a tribal confederation to an early state. So the story of Ung Duong Vuong is not merely the story of a king, it is the story of a society learning how to survive in a harsher historical environment.
The legends surrounding him, though mythic in form, clearly reflect the anxieties of the age, fears of insecurity, betrayal, and the fragility of power when it no longer rests entirely on tradition. If Van Long represented a world in which humans lived in harmony with nature and community, Ao Lok represented a world in which humans began to organize in response to history itself. This shift was unavoidable, and from this moment forward, Vietnamese history would take on clearer features of statehood, warfare, and territorial politics. Seen from centuries later, a continuous thread becomes visible. From the 12th Hung King Dynasty to Ang Duong Vuong and Ao Lok, this was not a replacement of old by new, but a transformation within the same civilization. Van Long did not die, it changed form in order to continue existing in a changing world. This process laid the foundation for all subsequent Vietnamese history, a history repeatedly shaped by external pressure, yet consistently defined by the preservation of cultural core. Survival was never based on overwhelming power alone, but on the ability to adapt, organize, and carry continuity forward. From this perspective, Ang Duong Vuong and Ao Lok do not mark the end of a story, but the beginning of a new sequence of challenges. For the first time, the ancient Vietnamese fully entered the currents of regional history. From here on, history would no longer unfold quietly as it had in the time of Van Long. It would be marked by confrontation, conflict, and decisions that carried existential weight. In this light, the 12th Hung King Dynasty and the era of Ang Duong Vuong Ao Lok are inseparable. They are two consecutive movements within the same historical composition, a civilization that learned how to end one era at the right moment so that it could begin again in another form. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope every video not only provides historical knowledge, but also helps you feel the depth, spirit, and cultural identity of Vietnam's past. If you find the content helpful or have any suggestions for the channel or individual videos, please feel free to leave a comment. Your feedback is extremely valuable and will help improve future content. Enjoy the video, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next story of Vietnamese history.